What if I told you that Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, predicted exactly how modern pornography would rewire our brains, nearly a century before the internet existed? Visual suggestion: split screen, vintage Jung photo, transitioning to modern smartphone. In 1912, Jung wrote something that seems almost prophetic today. He warned about what happens when we reduce the sacred act of human intimacy to mere images and fantasy. He understood something that neuroscientists are only now confirming with brain scans and clinical data. Today, we're going to explore how pornography literally changes the structure of your brain, and why Jung's theories about the psyche, the shadow, and individuation provide the most complete framework for understanding this modern epidemic. This isn't a moral lecture. This is about understanding the psychological and neurological mechanisms that are hijacking your brain's reward system, fragmenting your psyche, and preventing you from becoming the person you're meant to be. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening inside your brain when you consume pornography, why it's so difficult to stop, and most importantly, what you can do about it from both a Jungian and neuroscientific perspective. Let's begin. Before we dive into pornography specifically, we need to understand Jung's fundamental insights about the human psyche. Carl Jung believed that the psyche, your complete psychological self, exists as an integrated whole, or at least it should. He divided the psyche into several components: the ego, your conscious mind; the personal unconscious, repressed memories and experiences; and the collective unconscious, universal archetypes shared by all humanity. Visual suggestion: diagram showing layers of consciousness. But here's what's crucial for our discussion. Jung observed that modern life tends to fragment this natural wholeness. He called the process of becoming whole individuation, the journey of integrating all aspects of yourself into a unified, authentic being. One of Jung's most important concepts is the shadow. The shadow represents all the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge: our repressed desires, our shame, our primitive instincts, our unlived potential. It's not inherently evil. It's simply unconscious. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Here's where this becomes critical for understanding pornography. When we refuse to integrate our shadow, we project it outward. We create fantasy worlds where our disowned desires can exist without us having to take responsibility for them. Pornography becomes the perfect projection screen for the shadow. Jung made a crucial distinction between sexuality as a biological drive and eros as a spiritual, connecting force. Eros, in Jungian psychology, is the principle of relationship, connection, and psychic wholeness. It's what draws us toward others not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Visual suggestion: Greek mythology imagery of eros. When sexuality is divorced from eros, when it becomes purely mechanical, purely visual, purely consumptive, something profound breaks down in the psyche. The sacred becomes profane. The connecting becomes isolating. Jung warned that modern society was already experiencing this split in his time. Imagine what he would say about today's pornography industry, which has perfected the art of delivering sexual stimulus completely divorced from human connection, intimacy, vulnerability, or relationship. Jung also spoke about the anima, the feminine aspect in men, and the animus, the masculine aspect in women. These are unconscious archetypes that deeply influence how we relate to the opposite sex and how we integrate our own contrasexual aspects. When a man repeatedly consumes pornography, he's not engaging with real women or even with the genuine feminine within himself. Instead, he's engaging with a distorted, projected fantasy of the anima, an impossible two-dimensional image that can never be integrated or related to authentically. This prevents genuine psychological development. The anima, instead of being integrated and matured through real relationships, becomes frozen in an adolescent, fantasy-based form. Men find themselves unable to relate to actual women because they've trained their psyche to respond only to the fragmented, pixelated projection. Now, let's bridge Jung's psychological insights with modern neuroscience. What happens in your brain when you watch pornography? Your brain has a reward system centered around a structure called the nucleus accumbens and a neurotransmitter called dopamine. This system evolved to reinforce behaviors essential for survival and reproduction: eating, social bonding, and sex. Here's the problem. Pornography delivers a supernormal stimulus, an exaggerated version of natural sexual cues that our brains never evolved to handle. It's like the difference between eating an apple and injecting pure sugar directly into your bloodstream. When you watch pornography, your brain releases massive amounts of dopamine, far beyond what natural sexual activity would produce. Why? Because the novelty, the ability to click to a new partner every few seconds, triggers dopamine release repeatedly. Your brain interprets this as an incredible mating opportunity. From an evolutionary perspective, the ability to mate with dozens or hundreds of different partners would have been extraordinarily advantageous for genetic success. Your primitive brain doesn't understand that these are just pixels on a screen. But here's where it gets darker, and where Jung's warnings about fragmentation become neurologically visible. With repeated exposure to these supernormal stimuli, your brain begins to protect itself through a process called desensitization. It downregulates dopamine receptors, literally reducing the number of receptors available to receive the signal. This is identical to what happens with drug addiction. You need more of the substance to get the same effect. In pornography addiction, users find themselves needing more extreme content, longer sessions, or more frequent use just to achieve the same level of arousal they once got from softer material. Studies using functional MRI scans have shown that heavy pornography users show reduced response in the reward circuitry when viewing pornography compared to control subjects. Their brains have become desensitized. The prefrontal cortex, your brain's executive control center, is responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and long-term planning. Research shows that pornography use weakens the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the reward system. This means reduced self-control. The very part of your brain that should be helping you resist compulsive behavior becomes less able to do its job. In Jungian terms, this is the ego losing its capacity to integrate and direct the energies of the psyche. The conscious will become subordinated to the unconscious drives. Your brain is constantly rewiring itself based on your experiences. This is called neuroplasticity. Every time you engage in a behavior, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with that behavior. When you repeatedly pair sexual arousal with pornography viewing, you're literally training your brain to respond sexually to screens rather than to real human beings. You're creating neural pathways that bypass genuine intimacy entirely. Research by Gary Wilson and others has documented young men experiencing erectile dysfunction with real partners while still being able to achieve arousal with pornography. This isn't a physical problem. It's a neurological one. The brain has been rewired to respond to artificial stimulus. There's a phenomenon in biology called the Coolidge effect, named after an amusing anecdote about President Calvin Coolidge. Male animals that become sexually satiated with one female will show renewed sexual interest when presented with a new female. Internet pornography exploits this mechanism with devastating efficiency. With unlimited novelty available at the click of a button, the Coolidge effect can be triggered endlessly, keeping users in a state of heightened arousal and dopamine release far beyond natural limits. This creates a destructive cycle: arousal, consumption, satiation, decreased sensitivity, need for novelty, more extreme content, further desensitization. The spiral continues downward. Jung spoke extensively about the difference between authentic desire arising from the self, your true integrated being, and compulsive behavior arising from unconscious complexes. Pornography addiction represents the latter. It's not genuine sexual desire. It's a compulsion driven by the need for dopamine stimulation, escape from uncomfortable emotions, or avoidance of authentic connection. Users often report that they're not even particularly aroused when they begin viewing pornography. It's become a habit, a ritual, a way of managing stress or boredom. The sexual component has become secondary to the neurochemical hit. This is what Jung would recognize as the psyche's energy being trapped in a regressive cycle rather than flowing forward toward individuation and growth. From a Jungian perspective, pornography trains men to relate to women as objects rather than subjects. This isn't just a feminist critique, it's a psychological observation about how the anima becomes distorted. When a man views pornography, he's not seeing women as complete human beings with their own subjectivity, emotions, and inner lives. He's seeing fragmented body parts, performances, roles. The women become projections of his shadow desires rather than real others with whom genuine relationship is possible. This fundamentally damages the capacity for intimacy. Real women, with their complexity, their moods, their own desires and boundaries, begin to seem frustrating or disappointing compared to the compliant fantasy on screen. The divine feminine, what Jung recognized as a crucial archetype for psychological wholeness, becomes profaned, reduced to consumable images. Jung understood that what we repress doesn't disappear, it gains power in the unconscious. Pornography use is almost always accompanied by shame, secrecy, and internal conflict. This shame drives the behavior deeper into the shadow. Users live double lives, presenting one face to the world while hiding their compulsive behavior. This split creates enormous psychological tension. The energy required to maintain this split, to keep the shadow hidden, drains vitality from conscious life. Users report feeling foggy, unmotivated, depressed. Jung would recognize this as psychic energy being consumed by the conflict between ego and shadow rather than being available for creative, productive living. Moreover, the shame itself becomes part of the addictive cycle. Users feel terrible after viewing pornography, which creates emotional discomfort, which they then relieve by viewing more pornography. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. Individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming your authentic self, requires facing your shadow, integrating your contrasexual aspects, and developing genuine relationships with others and with your own unconscious. Pornography addiction prevents all of this. Instead of facing the shadow and integrating it consciously, users remain trapped in projection and fantasy. Instead of developing their anima through genuine relationships with women, men remain fixated on impossible fantasy images. Instead of moving forward in psychological development, they remain stuck in adolescent patterns of relating to sexuality. Jung believed that humans have an innate drive toward wholeness and self-realization. Pornography addiction represents this drive being hijacked and diverted into an endless loop that leads nowhere. The real-world consequences are devastating. Men report finding their partners less attractive after heavy pornography use. They experience performance anxiety, erectile dysfunction, and delayed ejaculation with real partners. But beyond the physical symptoms, there's a deeper intimacy problem. Real intimacy requires vulnerability, presence, and the capacity to relate to another person's authentic being. Pornography trains users to be spectators rather than participants, to consume rather than connect. Partners of pornography users consistently report feeling betrayed, inadequate, and objectified. The relationship becomes contaminated by the fantasy world that their partner inhabits. From a Jungian perspective, this represents the failure of eros, the connecting principle, and the triumph of isolation and fragmentation.